Okay, I find it interesting that you were schooled, got your PhD, learned about biology, but this whole like way of living, a whole system of using energy inside the
Mhm.
body, and again, all the positive effects, like they just like breeze past it and don't really teach you much about it until you have to learn about this 20 years later and discover that the whole linchpin of what we're told about nutrition is not true, has never been proven. It was a hypothesis. It still is to this day, and it sure didn't really help us with what we thought it was going to help with, which was heart disease. That's still the number one killer today.
Yeah, it is. And I'll just tell you a little story about someone I was just talking to, a friend of mine, won't mention names, but her brother was just undergoing what we call cabbage surgery, so coronary artery bypass graft, cabbage. So bypass surgery, people call it commonly. And I was just asking her how it was going, and he's in his early 50s, so that's pretty darn young, especially when I'm north of 60. So, and having that kind of bypass surgery usually indicates long-term lifestyle choices that were not great. And anyway, I was saying, yeah, it's pretty as routine as opening your chest and stopping your heart can be, but it's pretty routine surgery these days, and the outcome should be good. She said, yeah, well, he has some other problems because he also had he's obese and he has diabetes and he's had cancer. And, in my book, I have a diagram that talks about chronic disease. And the main chronic diseases are just what I said: cancer, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and probably Alzheimer's. You can add that in there as a neurological condition. And those are kind of the four horsemen, of morbidity and mortality, the chronic disease. And those are all mostly related to lifestyle choices, which is lack of exercise, poor diet, and too much alcohol, whatever. Uh, but to try and figure out what was most important in causing that kind of chronic disease, there's an exhaustive study done, believe it was published in 2017 in the journal The Lancet, that looked at the global cause of these chronic diseases. So chronic disease is opposed to acute things, that happen suddenly, like infections and so on. And they determined that overall, if you looked at all of the lifestyle choices, they looked at smoking, alcohol and drug abuse. They looked at sedentary behavior and lack of exercise, which are related but different things. That nutrition was more important than any of them. In fact, it was more important than all the rest of them combined.
Wow.
So if you think about those diseases that cause the morbidity and mortality, the ones we just mentioned, cardiovascular disease, cancer, diabetes, Alzheimer's, um, are they really different diseases or are they manifestations of the same thing? And I would argue that we're coming to a new understanding. I think Peter Attia calls this medicine 3.0, that these are not, I mean, they're diseases, but just because we call them diseases, right? But they are related, and they're related to metabolic health, in poor metabolic health. And that goes right back to the cellular molecular level and really what's happening at the mitochondrial level, which are the energy converters within the cell. And so when you start investigating that, you'll see poor metabolic health. And there is something called syndrome X or metabolic disease, which is, high blood pressure, dyslipidemia, so the lipid panels are not right, obesity, and so on. It's called metabolic disorder. But these are just manifestations of that same metabolic disorder becoming the different chronic diseases that we like to name as cancer and cardiovascular disease. But they're all related to inflammation. They're all inflammatory conditions. They're all related or exacerbated by insulin resistance, and they're all aggravated or exacerbated by obesity. And those three things all make each other worse. I think it's on page 57 or so in BioDiet. I have this little diagram, that triangle. I call it the axis of illness, right? So insulin resistance, inflammation, and obesity. And I've gone all over the world. I've presented conferences all over the place. Said, you know, two things I ask people. I go, is there anything wrong with this model? If there is, tell me. Zero. Like every physician will go, yeah, if we get inflammation down, obesity down, insulin resistance down, we could prevent a whole lot of chronic disease from happening or from getting worse, for starters. And the other thing I always ask them is, what is it about a saturated fat that's so, and no, nobody's ever been able to tell me what it is about a saturated fat that causes a problem, with the exception of palmitic acid. But it's not the palmitic acid in your diet, it's what you produce due to poor metabolic health that causes those problems. So getting back to the root cause of all this, if we look at diet and poor diet being a causative factor in all of these chronic diseases, then does changing diet improve that? And in terms of a scientific study, there isn't enough money on the planet to do a blind controlled study because everybody's got to eat and you'd have to follow thousands of people for tens or 20, 30 years, tens of years. And then look at the rates of healthy and there's just it's so expensive. I mean, our studies at the Ohio State University with about 20 people in the experimental side, it's like $1 million to do those studies for 20 people over 12 weeks. But what you can do, what we try to do at the BC Cancer Agency, and I'm not there anymore, by the way. I was a visiting scientist there, so the bio you're reading is a little bit dated. But I should mention my colleague there, Dr. Jerry Crystal, won a very prestigious award called the Rogers Award, which, in Canada is probably second in value only to a Nobel Prize. Like it's a very significant for his life's work on low carbohydrate diets and cancer. Um, so any of those people out there that are listening or watching that think, oh, keto diets are a fad, I can tell you they're not a fad. There's 20 years of hard science behind them. We do very sophisticated studies, more so than the other nutritional studies you see, which are these sort of retrospective survey, meta-analyses thing. This is real hardcore cellular molecular science. And a little shout out to my colleague, big shout out to my colleague, Dr. Jeff Volek at The Ohio State University. And he and Tim Noakes and newly minted Dr. Alex Buga have just published a paper looking at carbohydrate use in athletes and so on. That old carbo loading thing is all gone by the wayside. Anyway, to summarize, if you reduce carbohydrate in your diet, if you take the carbohydrate out of your diet, now this isn't for everybody, but for about 7 out of 8 people, you will greatly reduce the impact it has on your metabolic health. And from that, we can show that it should then be a preventative measure from getting these diseases in the first place. So I said we can't really prove the latter, and nobody ever will. So, although I would argue, back in the hunter-gatherer days, we weren't eating pizza and cornflakes and stuff like that. We were eating mostly meat. And are you carnivore? You were
I
carnivore?
am.
You are,
Yeah,
yeah.
I am.
And another of our colleagues that I've just been talking to recently that I follow, Dr. Bronson Dant. He's written a couple of books and some papers. He's sort of a citizen scientist, but a super smart guy. So I think he goes by Coach Dant too.
That's
He's
right.
a fitness instructor as well. But um, he's also a carnivore. And I should mention we have been doing, I haven't, but we've been doing studies on looking at carnivore diets and the expected, increase in rates of cardiovascular and zero. There's been zero, nobody, they haven't had any adverse effects of people that have adopted carb. In fact, most of the effects have been very positive. So people, lose body fat, have more energy, all the blood lipids are better and so on. So I guess to get back to the original thing, all the original stuff about, saturated fats and meat and stuff being bad for your health was patently wrong. And I would like to shout out to the folks, and I should mention, full disclosure that Dr. Volek that I mentioned was on the advisory panel for the new US dietary guidelines that have been proposed. And they've, if you look at a ketogenic diet and that, they're pretty much the same, with a couple of exceptions. For a ketogenic diet, you'd want to reduce your carbohydrate load as much as possible. So any of that bread stuff, it's not necessary. We probably wouldn't eat that. And secondly, for some bizarre reason, they have like butter, fat, fish, beef, all that stuff. You should eat a lot of that or more of it, more protein and all that. But you're not going to be able to eat that and still come within their 10% recommendation for saturated fats. And I think this is one of the problems with decisions by committee is if you talk to any of the scientific researchers, they'll go, well, the pyramid kind of makes sense, but that's not a 10% saturated fat pyramid. So why you're still making that recommendation when there's no science behind that anyway, I don't know. But you shouldn't eat, seed oils and, monounsaturated fats are better than polyunsaturated fats because they're lower inflammatory effect. And saturated fats, as I'll say again, is the cleanest burning fuel you can put in your body. And if that becomes a big portion of your calories, your cells will actually adapt to burning that, and you won't have excessive triglycerides in your blood. I've been keto for I don't know, almost 20 years now. And even as I age, my triglycerides are super low. Like we use different units there, so it wouldn't make sense to come up with the numbers, but really low because I'm burning them all the time. My blood sugar's fine. My blood lipids are fine. I don't have, excessive fat in my blood or anything like that. I have a lot of HDL, which is pretty good if it's the right kind. But yeah, it's so I guess I'm a sample size of one, but I did also when I started this 15, 20 years ago, I was about 30 pounds heavier. And that was just fat, and that's all gone. And I still, when I weighed in today, I was 147. So I was up to almost 180, and that was all mid-abdominal fat, a little jellier and stuff like that. But never, I was always just pushing up against what would be considered overweight on that old BMI scale we don't use anymore. So I was never even overweight, but I was pushing up against it, and I certainly had a belly. But that went away within the first 12 weeks, and I could say almost 20 years later, it's still gone, as long as I stay on the diet, which I plan to do for life.